I think we're ready to get started. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for the latest installment here. Just a quick couple of announcements as usual, but first introductions. My name is Brianne Henning. I'm a professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga University in Eastern Washington State, and I'm the executive editor of the critical edition of Whitehead, and happy to be one of our co-vectors here in our group here. And I'm going to share just a couple of announcements that you might have also received via email. The first one is a change to the planned conference on the critical edition of Whitehead, the second volume that is. We, really were hoping to have it later in the year anyway, and there's another conference that's going to be held at the end of the year. So because the book only just came out in February and so on, in addition to that, we've had a new opportunity to expand sort of the potential impact of this virtual conference. We're also going to make it so that we'll edit a special issue of the journal Process Studies based upon the conference papers. And so given the fact that people are still buying the book and it's a hefty volume, and the need to then submit a paper proposal, we decided to push off by a year this whole project. So similar due dates, just pushing back 1 year, which gives you a little bit more time. Get the book, digest it, think about a proposal. So you've got a year. So get on it and think about what you might want to write and propose for that conference, which will now be virtually in September of 2022. So I think that's the right choice. I think that's a good option. Let's see. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, and what was it? I don't know. Joe, was there another update that we had that we wanted to give in addition to that? Other than just we have more meetings coming up for this reading group. I don't know that we have anything else. Okay.
I immediately recall.
Okay. So that's all as far as updates. Before we jump into it, Brianne, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, so just a reminder to everyone that we are going to have 2 more meetings in this archive reading group. We'll be meeting in May, and then the last is just at the start of June. And then we're just going to press pause and see how things sort out. It's been a great experiment, and certainly one that's had more interest than we first anticipated. But we'll just let everything that we've been swimming in marinate for a while, and hopefully be able to direct it to some of these other projects that Brian has talked about. So now we'll turn it over to Joe, who is going to give us, I think, a mini masterclass in the background of thinking about this social ethics seminar. Thanks, Joe.
You're too kind, Brianne. Anyway, hello again, everybody. For those of you who may have not attended the previous sessions, my name is Joe Petek. I've been with the Whitehead Research Project for 8 years now, where I'm the chief archivist and also the assistant editor for the critical edition of Whitehead. And I'm coming to you from Wisconsin for what that's worth. Anyway, as with previous sessions, I'd like to start us off by giving a little background for the reading we're discussing today, which is Whitehead's presentation in Richard Clark Cabot's Social Ethics Seminar during the fall 1926 term, which was his 3rd year at Harvard. And I'm excited for this reading for a couple of reasons. One is that the social sciences and social ethics aren't topics that Whitehead addressed all that often, at least explicitly. So in that sense, he was speaking a little out of his comfort zone, which is something I'll come back to in a little later. But for me, as the WRP's archivist, the thing that I actually find the most exciting about this thing personally is the form of it, because this is the only document I know of in which we have Whitehead's words recorded as he spoke them, as opposed to either more incomplete student notes of presentations or his own written manuscripts. Obviously, a lot of Whitehead's books were based on public lectures, but they weren't stenographers' accounts of his original delivery like this is. And this is actually important for a couple reasons. The first reason it's important is that we know for a fact that Whitehead tended to deviate from his prepared remarks in the actual delivery. And part of the reason we know that is by looking at the differences between the manuscript for Whitehead's first Harvard lecture and the notes of the students who attended it. some of which you might remember if you were here for our first reading group session. Basically, there were things recorded by multiple note takers for that lecture that showed he actually added things that weren't in his manuscript. So in that sense, the stenographer's account is a unique opportunity to see a text that is more authentically a Whitehead lecture than literally any other document we have. The other reason it's important is that we're getting an account of the ensuing discussion, which I think is about as revealing or maybe even more so than Whitehead's prepared remarks. And again, this sort of discussion being fully recorded is unique. I don't know of any other instance of something like this with Whitehead being recorded this way. But now I want to just back up and talk about how this document came to be, because it's pretty wild that this thing even exists at all. I mean, when I first saw it, it didn't even occur to me at first that this could be a stenographer's account, because how does that even happen? Who hires a stenographer to record every single word in a random Harvard seminar? Well, it turns out that Richard Clark Cabot did, at least for this class. So let me tell you a little bit about Cabot and about this class, which will hopefully explain how this crazy thing happened. So Cabot was a born and bred New Englander who graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1892. Following his graduation, he began working in the outpatient department of Massachusetts General Hospital. 2 years later, in 1894, he married Ella Lyman, whose family was, in fact, fabulously wealthy, which is going to be important for our story here. Being socially conscious and now extremely wealthy, Cabot actually established the first hospital social services department in 1905, and when the hospital refused to pay for it, he himself paid the salaries of all its staff for 12 years. And here I want to read you a passage from one of Whitehead's letters to his son North, in which he talks about Cabot's wealth. I think it really gives a wonderful sense of Cabot's character. So here it is, quote, Agnes Hawking told Richard Cabot, an over-conscientious New Englander who has an important engagement for every half hour of the day, to call for Mummy at 3:15 and take her to his school entertainment about a mile off. Accordingly, Cabot turned up. That Mrs. Hawking should have thought it possible to tell an immensely busy man of some importance to fetch Mummy in his car, and that he should of course have complied at great inconvenience, is just like them. Of course, no one, not a millionaire, keeps a chauffeur. Cabot is a millionaire via his wife, but is much too conscientious to spend money in that way. The idea of New Englanders flaunting wealth is quite wrong. They are much more likely to be living on half their incomes and either investing the rest or giving it away, about equal chances which. So that was Whitehead on Cabot in a letter of December 1924, at the end of his first semester at Harvard, about 2 years before the seminar we're looking at today. Anyway, while Cabot was still at Massachusetts General Hospital, he began teaching philosophy and clinical medicine at Harvard in 1902. Then in 1919, he took up the chair of Harvard's Social Ethics Department, which had been established in 1905 and housed on the second floor of the newly constructed Emerson Hall, the first floor of which housed the philosophy department. So the philosophy and social ethics departments were literally working in the same building on different floors, so it's no great surprise that Whitehead and Cabot were acquainted early on. And so now we come to Cabot's seminar itself. The full course name as it appeared on the syllabus was Social Ethics 20A, Fundamentals Underlying the Social Sciences. His stated objective was to work out cooperatively the fundamentals of the social sciences. By cooperatively, he meant with other departments in the university. And here Cabot is worth quoting in a statement with which Whitehead was undoubtedly in full agreement. Quote, my aspiration is to knock down some of the interdepartmental lines of Harvard, or to weaken, at any rate, the defenses and dikes that keep departments apart. I feel strongly that one of our greatest evils here is the lack of any synthesis. Each department teaches the best it knows, and with no considerable awareness of what the others are doing. I cannot help thinking, when I visited some of the courses last spring, how good it would be for other departments to hear that teaching. Unquote. The general format of the course was for Cabot to invite members from across Harvard's various university departments to give their own views as to what constituted the social sciences. The speaker would give a presentation which would ideally include answers to 6 specific questions that Cabot had posed in the syllabus, followed by questions from the audience. Meanwhile, the students, to again use Cabot's words, were the small end of the course, which seems to have been his polite way of saying that he was more concerned with getting the various faculty departments to learn from each other than he was with teaching students per se, at least for this course. And it's this last fact which I think best explains the situation we find ourselves in with the notes of Whitehead's guest appearance in the class. Cabot believed that the discussions between the various great men of the Harvard faculty in this class were going to be very important, and so he wanted to keep an accurate record of what was said. Being independently wealthy, it seems that he hired a professional stenographer to keep that record. And I say Cabot hired someone as opposed to Harvard because it seems vanishingly unlikely that the university itself would have paid for such a thing. But given the voluminousness and apparent word-perfect accuracy of these notes, this is the only explanation that makes sense. I just don't see how this document could be anything else. And one oddity that helps substantiate this theory is that the stenographer made a few errors, suggesting a lack of philosophical training, such as typing ontological, where Whitehead clearly would have said ontological. A Harvard student taking a class in Emerson Hall probably wouldn't have made errors of this kind. So now that I've talked somewhat at length about the form of this thing, I do want to briefly mention a few things about the actual content of it. The first is something that you wouldn't necessarily know unless you had bought and read our recently published second volume of Whitehead's Harvard Lectures, in which this text appears. It's the fact that sometimes Whitehead would actually recycle material, that is, repeat remarks from his students for his students that he delivered earlier somewhere else. And in this case, he repeated much of the same remarks that he delivered in the seminar to his own Philosophy 3P students 12 days later in his lecture of October 30th, 1926. But although what he said to his students is substantially similar to what he said in Cabot's class, there's at least one key difference, which is that he talks about God as having a place within his own philosophical system, something he did not do in Cabot's seminar. And I'm actually going to paste this paragraph from that lecture into the chat here if I can. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So people can refer to that if they want. It appears on page 210 of the second volume of the Harvard Lectures for those who have the book. And now I'll just read it. Quote, "For Descartes, God, in addition to being the only substance which has absolute independence, is only substance which is self-creative, only process for which process of creation is also the creature. But in Whitehead, this is general characteristic of all actual entities. On one hand, deny God has absolute substantial independence. On other, raise all entities to level of being self-creative." They are their own originations. Every self which is beyond them is in itself a character of the specific creative act in them. Insofar as actual entities are creatures, result of processes of activity, God ought to be called creature, unquote. So that's that which people may or may not want to take up in our discussion. The second observation I want to make is right at the juncture just before Cabot opens things up for questions on page 402. Notice that he asks Whitehead whether he, quote, cares to take the questions suggested for discussion. And what does Whitehead do? He deflects. He says he thinks it would be, quote, impertinent of me to answer those. They are just the questions I should ask you rather than to state myself. Now, I have to say, I think if I was Cabot in that moment, I would have been a little annoyed with Whitehead. Cabot had quite pointedly wanted people from different departments and areas of specialization to try their best to answer these 6 questions from their own perspectives. And yet Whitehead, in a sort of aw shucks way, with his signature caution and humility, declined to follow the format that Cabot had laid out for the course, avoiding questions which he apparently felt himself unqualified to answer, and instead filled a large portion of his presentation with philosophical background, which one might see as having somewhat dubious applicability to the topic at hand. So in that sense, it's interesting to notice what Whitehead avoids talking about in this document. But I will point out here that Whitehead remained pretty cagey about trying to establish the foundations of an ethics even years later. we have a fascinating journal entry, one of Whitehead's teaching assistants, John Goheen, in which he had a private conversation with Whitehead in November of 1933, 7 years after the seminar. It says, quote, "As for finding the ground for an ethic, Whitehead confessed his inability to think the complexity of the situation through. The key to an ethic, he said, is perhaps so simple that we fail to find it for its simplicity," unquote. That being said, Whitehead does, in fact, arguably formulate a pretty neat formulation when he says on page 397 of this document that, quote, "I look on social ethics as a conciliation of the two diverse expressions by the statement, 'Thou shalt not steal,' which is the assertion of a measured privacy, and 'property is robbery,' which is an assertion of the complete socialism. How you can have private ends in a society without robbery is really, I hold, the topic of social ethics," unquote. Now, I can't be the only one who read those lines and immediately thought of Whitehead's "life is robbery" line from Process and Reality. And in case you're curious, because I certainly was, I did a keyword search in all of Whitehead's books for the word robbery and found that PR is in fact the only place where it appears, there and here. So I don't think it's out of line to see this formulation in Cabot's class as a precursor for that passage in PR. Lastly, I just want to make an observation that's more or less purely humorous. At the top of page 404, James Ford asks Whitehead to please explain what he meant when he talked about an entity as, quote, "an end in itself." It's a question coming from someone who was not a professional philosopher, someone who appears to have just wanted a basic, clear definition of a term. And instead, Whitehead answers him by immediately going off into the weeds with an answer which I would guess left poor Dr. Ford more confused than he had been already. So I just had to laugh reading that because it's that sort of stereotypical answer from a philosopher who just can't help himself. He always has to make things more complicated. He can't keep anything simple or give any simple explanations. It's just the sort of thing that we couldn't have gotten anywhere else but from a stenographer's account like this one. Anyway, I think that's it for me, so I'll turn it back over to Brianne so we can get the discussion started. And sorry if that was all a little long.
Oh, geez, Joe, it was great. I just
Hey,
had,
Brianne, if we, before we start, I also had a comment and a question for Joe. We don't have to do it immediately, but I wanted to throw in there just to.
no, please. My quick question was, Joe, just a clarification, this quote about the greatest evil being the lack of synthesis, this was Cabot?
Yeah, that was Cabot.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Go ahead.
Thanks. So a comment, just sharing a quick story and then a question for you, Joe. Just the comment is just a fun historical intersection, and it's just interesting to look at this time period. So there's a fund called the Hawking-Cabot Fund for Systematic Philosophy that was started by William Ernest Hawking. Well, and this very Cabot, Dr. What is his first name?
Richard Clark Cabot.
Richard Clark Cabot. Exactly how it was formed is not entirely clear to me. I think it was Richard Hawking, William W.E.'s son. Somehow they brought money together from both of their fortunes and put it in a fund called the Hawking-Cabot Fund for Systematic Philosophy. We, in fact, as an addition, applied to funds to this and received funding from them for our first two editorial conferences at Harvard. And so Dr. Cabot's fortune in part funded what became then eventually the editing of the first volume of the critical edition and the formation of this project, which is a fun sort of coincidence. And of course, we know that William Ernest Hawking was one of the people who helped to get Whitehead to Harvard and was sitting in on his classes and was a famous colleague of his at Harvard in the department at the time. So there's just these fun intersections to sort of realize for us, sort of after the fact, we kind of were like, oh, that's the same Cabot. Well, yeah. Oh wait, he lectured in his class. That's kind of crazy. The question I had for you is just a little bit more on social ethics. I have a feeling that when people hear this term, they might conjure in their mind, what that combination, addition of the word social to ethics would mean. And I fear that we're probably not thinking about the right thing when we just would sort of would a department of ethics, we would have an idea what that would mean. A department of social ethics would be like, okay, I think I suspect we're, and your introduction partly did this, but I suspect that if we were to name this department today, would it not be a department of sociology and criminology? That would be the name of it. This didn't exist in 19, I was just looking it up. So the first department of sociology was at University of Chicago in 1892 or something like that. Harvard didn't have a department of sociology until the 30s. Given what Hawking or what Cabot was doing, how would you describe what that department was doing today if we were to, because we wouldn't use the term social ethics. I think that went into obsolescence. Maybe you or others know what we would call it today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as you said, I think it would probably be like a sociology department, maybe. There was an article that I think you and I looked at when we were writing our introduction for the second volume of the critical edition, where, and I believe it was written by Cabot himself, and he talked about it as straddling a line between philosophy, economics, and Christian morals. So yeah, I think it would probably be a sociology department. I mean, this was, again, as far as the philosophy department, I mean, there wasn't even a separate psychology department, really. Those were all rolled together. So, yeah, it was a different time. And even having what do you call it? Social workers and social services departments were fairly like new ideas themselves at the time. So, yeah, it was all still sorting itself out, and I think sociology is probably the answer.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so just to remind us all, Brianne is going to sort of lead us with some ideas for how to engage. I'll just remind us of, orient us to the Zoom sort of options here. If you haven't done so already, it might be a good idea to open the chat window and potentially the participants window. But in particular, you want to notice the reactions button at the bottom where you can raise your hand, and that'll put you in the digital queue, and then you can unmute yourself and we can chat. And so just remember those sort of orientations, and then I'll hand it back to Brianne.
Great. Well, this was a challenging read, I thought, and a different kind of just a different level of content. And so I was grappling with the first question. But my first question I'm going to post in the chat. We'll call this the 3-minute opener. How do you understand Whitehead's use or repurposing of this term original sin in this lecture? I thought maybe just to start us thinking together, we could, Brian, if you would be able to kind of just have the text on hand, that if you've picked out a particular passage, or if you just have a sense that came to you in your notes or your impressions, I'd love to hear it. I'm going to put a timer for 3 minutes so everyone can weigh in as they'd like, and just hold your answers till the end, and we'll populate the chat when I ask you to at the end of the 3 minutes. How do you understand Whitehead's use or repurposing of the term original sin in this lecture? 3 minutes on the clock. We'll see you on the other side. Got about one more minute. All right, as you're ready, you can go ahead and start to hit enter. And we'll just start with a few of these and get us thinking together. All right, our opening question was, how do you understand Whitehead's use or repurposing of the term original sin in this lecture? Lynn says, I understand this to mean the potential for good and evil is present in all of creation. And I'm just going to work down the list if you want to follow. Brian is quoting from 398 and 99. Quote, and this is the doctrine of social solidarity, which I express by the two doctrines of original virtue and original sin. The value of any one is infectious throughout the universe. Miriam says original sin as robbery, inherent in creativity, and hence, quote, whatever you are infects the world, end quote. There exists no innocence or purity. Mario says it could have the purpose to highlight that the origin of the destructive influence is not part of a permanent nature of humankind, but taking place in each new event as potentially destructive influence of what we are becoming into the environment and our own future. We'll do a few more. William says, idiosyncratic, affective, rhetorical intensification of consequences of the evils of substantialist thinking. And this is page 396. We'll probably take a look at a couple of these passages. Juan says, original sin and original virtue become doctrines or concepts for Whitehead to develop the concept of solidarity. In my view, the former points to the concrete and the latter to the abstracted. Interesting. Ruth is also pointing us to 399, quote, sin is the worst part of it, end quote. It here being the term original sin defined. In Whitehead's conception, evil is not construed as something negative so much as something destructive. Quote, so evil is really plunging the world in the direction of nothingness, end quote, Whitehead says, by its own undoing of order. Let's see how many more we've got. Well, we'll just go through them. Rudiger says, I found it strange. An actual entity is impacting the whole future. No distinction between sin and virtue is needed. Eric, very fascinating, borrowing from Christian doctrine. I think that, quote, sin for Whitehead here is somewhat synonymous with his definition of evil. That is, it is a destructive force with a general flow of progressual creation. And thus, in the routes of history contained in each actual entity, there is some trace of that destructive past, along with some trace of the creative original virtue. I think Whitehead's reading of original here is rather literal, meaning that these are inherent in the origin of actual entities. As Whitehead says, if the, quote, sin outweighed the, quote, virtue, the universe would be moving to self-destruction. Thus, it must be lesser in the average actual entity. And a few more short ones. Thomas, I find it noteworthy that Whitehead's reference to original sin is in regard to, quote, thou shalt not steal, end quote. He later equates this to the evil of individual satisfaction at the expense of higher purpose or attainment. Joe says, of course, Cabot himself helpfully asked Whitehead for more about just this question when he talks about something which he said in Religion in the Making, namely that evil is positive and destructive, while good is positive and creative. It's a good connection across text. Thanks, Joe. Michael says, Whitehead follows the Hebrew theology of what today we would call the selfish mean, in contrast to Aristotle's human magnanimity. And Richard, last comment, evil is not just destructive, but the force towards disorder and then nothingness. After the horrors of World War I, this sense of the potential for disorder and nothingness must have been part of the psyche of many. So Brian, I'm wondering if we could just pull up, I don't know, we've got a couple images here of 396, 399, and I would love to hear now if we would want to just unmute our mics and you can use our reaction buttons. Now that you've heard your colleagues weighing in on this, why do you think Whitehead opted for this particular formulation of this original virtue, original sin? What was why this, seemingly probably quite well-known phrase? Anyone have any thoughts or speculations on why or how this worked here? And we can, and Brian will help us to look at any particular passages. So if you want to get in the queue, you can raise your hand digitally, and that will be a good start. And if that's not working for you, just raise your actual hand in the video and we'll try to keep an eye out. All right, Brian, it's looking like Eric's got a hand.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself, Eric. Morning, or at least here.
Well, yes, good afternoon.
Yeah, and just a reminder, maybe just quickly introduce yourself and where you're coming from, and then feel free to share.
Sure. Well, my name is Eric Elder. I'm a doctoral candidate in music theory at Brandeis University, and my work has a lot to do with Whitehead. And I am in Brookline, Massachusetts, right down the road from Fenway Park. Coming off of the end of Brianne's question, I think, where she asked about the purpose more of this reference, I think I get the sense that the purpose is actually to make his presentation align with the goals of the seminar, and I take that from those questions that that Joe mentioned in the footnote on page 402. In that, we're looking essentially at ethical issues with great moral implication, or perhaps vice versa. And I also take this formulation to be really effective because it, in my reading, places a hierarchy between those original, those values, those characteristics, original sin and original virtue, which are generalized and affect all actual entities in Whitehead's thought, and the idea of words, thou shalt not steal, and somebody help me out. Why I'm just blanking here. The other part of that dichotomy, thou shalt not steal, and robbery property is robbery. That seems to take that general idea, which would apply to all actual entities equally, and place it in a more human context. So, in other words, I think that there's a subtle narrowing, even though we can think that Whitehead's system is generally universal. I think that it implies this subtle narrowing, which would speak to the crime aspect that seems to be common in this program in which he's addressing.
Thanks for that, Eric. And I didn't realize you were doing music theory. That's very cool. I'd love to, another time, I'd love to hear what you're up to. That sounds really interesting. I tend to agree with Eric that part of what Whitehead is doing here is trying to take his ideas that are in the process of formation here after having written Religion of the Making Science of the Modern World, before having done the Giffords. He's trying to figure out how to relate his work to what Cabot's interested in hearing about. And it to my reading, it usually seems that he turns it into sort of a metaphysics of morals. He's trying to link his metaphysics to these ethical questions, which he's never fully comfortable doing. And so when he uses original sin and he uses robbery, and he's using original virtue, he's, I think, being really confusing. I think he's confusing the hell out of his audience. I think they're utterly, like, I don't know how much they understood what the heck he was doing if they didn't know his other work. I mean, we can see what he's doing because we understand his other work, but I'm not sure how helpful. I think, in fact, it was unproductive to use these terms, which would have had such strong associations for his audience, and his clarifications didn't clarify much. Please feel free.
William, did you have a hand too?
Yeah, briefly, just I'm hearing his original sin and original all these original provocative Christian uses. He's kind of hijacking the terminology, using, adopting, appropriating in a provocative way. And if you look at his sense of what the role of philosophy is, as in his first lecture to the Harvard community, it's nudging civilization toward good. So philosophy is salvific for him. So this is not beyond his reach of the poetry of thinking. He's got a rhetoric going on here, and he's using it, and he believes something here. That's all I wanted to say. It's not out of place, but it's coming out of the midst of the Wordsworthian poetry of his thought there.
I take your point, William, and I don't disagree with you at all. I fear his audience that was lost on them, but I think you're still right philosophically from our vantage point. I tend to agree with you.
Yeah.
Thanks, William. And I'll try and keep an eye on, it's hard to, all my little windows here, but Lynn, please.
One of the things that really fascinates me about Whitehead is how often he seems to oppose ideas, original sin, original virtue, even process and reality. Again and again, he opposes things almost as if he were Hegelian, but he read Hegel and he rejected Hegel. So what I understand that he's trying to do is to take these ideas which are often opposed and weave them together again and show how they're connected. I'd be interested in other people's reactions to that idea.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm tempted to pause for a second, and if you wanted to comment on Lynn's point in particular, I'd encourage you to go ahead and unmute now before we move on to Juan's question or comment. Does anybody want to contribute to Lynn's? Kevin, did you want to contribute a response to Lynn's comment?
Yes, really briefly. When I'm reading a lot in Whitehead's philosophy of science and in the concept of nature and other early books, and even in later writings, for Whitehead, they're sort of polar opposites. They're not really opposites. They're mutually implicative. Yes. Mutually implicative is the term that I keep using over and over again, and finding
good term.
Among even in his theory of relativity and his early writings, and even later on in other writings in not Adventures of Ideas, but Modes of Thought. The notion of mutually implicative and they're not dialectical, total opposites, Hegelian opposites. And
Right.
I think right now it comes out of his notion of whole part thinking in terms of geometry. So they're not dialectical opposites that somehow merge in coincidence of opposites, but it's a mutually implicative tension of polar opposites. I think that pervades his thinking.
Thank you, Kevin. And Lynn, I forgot to ask where you were coming from. And
Oh, I'm sorry. I live in Claremont.
oh, excellent.
I'm
And
double
Kevin?
masked.
Sorry, I'm Bellingham, Washington. I'm just a few miles from the border.
Oh, very good. On the other side of the Cascade Curtain. Well, very good. Thank you both. Let's move on, if we could, to Juan. Quickly introduce yourself, say where you're coming from, and feel free to share.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Juan Ferret. I founded, I run the Philosophic Systems Institute. And if I can take 20 seconds to make a point about what we do, which is relevant to this conversation, is we created an institute that is based on pragmatism and process philosophy. So Whitehead and Dewey and Peirce and James have been instrumental in the creation of an institute. And what we do is we sort of bring education, philosophy, the arts, humanities to populations that don't have access to this. So we create programs, for instance, for point F in the screen, people who have been in the federal prison, and we have them engage with that sort of conversations, and in order to minimize recidivism. So we bring the process into action. That's how we see it, shortly. And I mentioned this because, and I'm glad to tell you more if anybody's interested. We're happy to tell you what we go through working with the federal government. It's kind of fun, and not really. But what we do, it really centers on what's here, right? We have people who have committed a sin, right? They've been in prison 30 years. And so this is not theoretical for us. And they're seen as criminals, they're seen as felons, and they will carry the felony for their whole existence. While at the same time, we recognize that we want them to be virtuous because they're returning to our community. 95% of people that go to prison, they return to our communities. And this dual aspect that I saw Whitehead do, I just, when I read this, I couldn't believe it, how brilliant it was. So I have a lot of things to say there, and also comments on the duality aspect from a practical point as well as a philosophical standpoint. But I really ultimately had a question, and I didn't know about the answer that you proposed, Brian. But my question was, and I just happened to, we're reading in our class, which is called Shadows to Light, with our participants who have been to prison. We're reading John Dewey's The Living Creature, the first chapter of Experience and Nature, in which he makes the case for understanding this concept of in ontology, the creature as becoming. So God becomes a creature as well, right? So it made a connection earlier. So I wonder how much of an influence Dewey had on the book that came up in 1925 on Whitehead, and I really don't know, and I would love to know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Whitehead references him quite regularly, and they engaged in a wonderful debate at the APA, Dewey and Whitehead, that we have. And so I would highly encourage you to look at that not debate is not the right term. They had a colloquium where they shared responses to each other's work, and Dewey's very uncomfortable with Whitehead's rationalism, and wants him to pick between experience and eternal objects. He doesn't like eternal objects for reasons that, and people who know Dewey's work will not be surprised. And he wants him to choose. And Whitehead's response boiled down is no. they're both true, and they both are needed. And so, but despite that, I would see the similarity, and others are probably more knowledgeable about Dewey than I am. But when in Experience in Nature, Dewey says that experience is in and of nature, like that it's not just that we experience nature, but it's in that experience is in nature as well as of nature, is a pan-experientialist metaphysics, even though Dewey's not comfortable with metaphysics, it is. And that puts him in league with Peirce and James and other pragmatists who are all wanting to overcome dualism, but at least in the Dewey side is uncomfortable really formulating a metaphysics and is more comfortable looking at the physics to defend that when he has his little essays on time and for other things. So I don't think there's any that I would see any inspiration from Dewey in this, but they both see similarities in common cause, and they have different dispositions. And there's a volume, if you're interested, you could also look at that we edited a few years ago in the Contemporary Whitehead Studies series on Whitehead and the Pragmatists, and several of the essays in there are on relationship of Dewey and Whitehead that you might find interesting as well.
Well, Brian, I might disagree just a little bit in the sense that in volume 2, in which this text appears, I know that during those first couple of years, Whitehead did talk about Dewey's experience in nature in his classes and recommend them to his students, at least in his seminars. And also, I just pasted, Juan, for you this letter into the chat. It's a link to one of our items on the WRL where Dewey writes to Whitehead and thanks him for reviewing one of his books and says, you know, I should have cited you an experience in nature and I didn't, and I'm sorry. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, and the other thing I can say just from memory is that there's a lot of correspondence we have between Whitehead and Paul Schilp about his Library of Living Philosophers volume, and that when Schilp asked him, who would you like to write essays? And Whitehead specifically said, oh, I'd love it if John Dewey could write something. So, you know, there is a possible.
But that's mutual respect and interest, but I don't know that shows that he's getting ideas from Dewey. He's respect, but you're right. He assigns Dewey's work regularly, but of course he assigns Russell's work and he assigns Broad's work, and you know, so the assigning of it doesn't necessarily tell us. He respects it, and it's valuable, and they kept reviewing each other's books and things like that. So there's a temperamental difference. Whitehead is a mathematician, and Dewey just really has trouble with how far Whitehead wants to go, and really wants to expunge the eternal objects. And there are Whiteheadians who are inspired by Dewey, who want to complete that project. What would Whitehead without the eternal objects look like? And George Allen is a good, I wouldn't say he's a Deweyan, but if you read his most recent work on Whitehead without God, that would be sort of a similar direction in that long running conversation. So I don't think Joe and I are necessarily disagreeing. You tell me. Okay. Thank you, Juan. It's really interesting. Sounds like interesting work, and Juan has posted a link to his project. So thank you for sharing a bit of what you do, Juan. That's really, really interesting. I think we'll go ahead and invite Ruth to introduce herself, and share with us what you're thinking.
Hi everyone. Thank you again for this wonderful continuing conversation. My name is Ruth Chad, and I'm a PhD student at Claremont School of Theology and Process Studies. I also teach religion, a very introductory level, Western religion, etc. My question and interesting, commentary is that he's using, in talking about original sin, I found this paper or these notes really fascinating in the sense that he's very purposely, to me, using words that are very religious doctrine and original sin coming out of theology. And nowhere once does he mention the original sin topic, the Augustinian originations, the ways in which, again, I'm surprised he doesn't even mention Kant's idea of, but he's kind of defining some of this as existing without the need for God. But I'm curious about that, first of all, because he is going off on more of the scientific backgrounds, referencing Descartes and Cartesian philosophy. But what the footnote for 396 that I'm kind of stuck on is that he gives a definition to something, and the note taker says, it's where it's the last paragraph, I I put it here under, and then there's a note for the footnote, which is a blank specialization that Whitehead gives. But Cabot gives the designation Protestant civilization, which is a huge footnote little thing. What is anyone's opinion? I'm curious about what Whitehead was saying here. Is he speaking about the whole of Protestant civilization as being problematic in this conversation? And thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Anyone interested in commenting on this passage? I was really desperately wanting some of the blanks to be filled in. It was like so many blanks at the end of sentences. You're like, what is the word? Eric, please.
Yeah, thank you. So this is, you're absolutely right. The blanks can be very frustrating. But I don't necessarily have an answer to Ruth's question, but maybe a question for Joe or you instead. It seems to me that sometimes these blanks represent not just one word, but large, perhaps expanses of words, you know, sentences at least. And so in a situation like this, where it seems that the stenographer has blank and then the word specialization, and Cabot has noted Protestant civilization, we might be missing much more than just what would have been Protestant civilization. Because it seems, and this is what I'm really curious about, it seems that, and I didn't have a chance to read, but it seems that Cabot's notes are much more sketchy than you know, sort of a literal transcript. So, you know, it could be here that it's quite possible that he talks about Protestant civilization and then goes on to tie that into some specialization, right? So I'm not so sure that the blank and specialization are supposed to go exactly together. I guess that's my point.
Well, I could try and go back and look at the original, but I mean, you're certainly right that I mean, I think we can see from some portions of this that they've got the, you know, he'll have a speaker name, and I think in at least one case there was a question from someone that the stenographer didn't catch at all, so it's just the name and then a blank and then Whitehead answering. But I think in this instance that wasn't actually that large a blank, and maybe that is all there was there. But yeah, it can be a little difficult to tell, and maybe I can find the original and share a bit of it on screen.
I was going to give Joe a second to pull up the original. He didn't comment much on that in his opening comments, but what we have, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, I think we have some handwritten leafs, and then we have typescript pages, and that we were taking the handwritten portions as being Cabot's notes and the typescript as the stenographer's work. And I don't know if the stenographer was sitting there taking shorthand and then later type them up, or if there was a way of typing them up at the time. But Joe might be able to show us visually on the screen what it looks like in terms of these blanks. Yeah, and I think William, you're probably are you trying to raise your hand, William?
Yes, I am. There, thank you. I noticed that Protestant civilization and specialization may have come to the ear similarly, and there may have been a word there originally, the ills of or the failures of Protestant civilization or ills of specialization, and we have a clue at the end of the sentence, namely all the individuals. So he's going to redo it and you know, generalize on it, namely all the individualism which is destroyed by sound ethics. So he puts it out, he's got an umbrella concept for it here, all the individualism. So whatever it is of civilization or specialization, it's an example of one of the individualisms that is destroyed by sound ethics. I just wanted to say that keep us on the rails anyway, maybe.
We definitely need to do that. So keep us on the rails, William. It's easy to spin off. I don't know what to make of that particular passage, Ruth, so I'm not particularly helpful, but Brianne, did you want to?
Well, I think we're ready to go on to another question. I guess I just wanted to say something to Lynn's point here. There's a phrase that I found, I believe on page 7, where where Whitehead uses the phrase "a supplementary truth," and I think that this is.
What was the passage or the page again? I can bring it up.
Page 7, I believe, supplementary truth. And I thought this, I've worked a lot on Whitehead's ideas of mutual dualisms or mutually requiring dualisms. And I see it actually as one of the areas where Whitehead really has a lot in common with non-Western traditions. Whether or not and to what degree he was influenced there is not clear. But what struck me in this, all that to say, I think that there's something really profoundly key about the notion of generative duality, and I think that it's generative not just conceptually. I think that the union of duality is often the activation of embodiment, and I think it struck me here, and maybe this seems really intuitive, but that there emerges this element of philosophy as a kind of exercise in argumentation, or making sure that that there are you're creating a kind of structure of logic that is either infallible, or that one can engage through analogy or these various devices, and that it just lives in that world. Yet there has always been, both in the West and in certainly in other traditions, this element of philosophy as something that you put on, right? Something that changes one's whole mode of being in the world, something that is transformative in terms of that you don't know, that you don't only know differently, that you are different, and a kind of philosophy of transformation. And I think William said something to this, nudging society to the good. But it's, I guess I just wondered if anyone has given any thought that, in a sense, Whitehead seems to be, people sometimes have said, as I remember, that Whitehead doesn't speak about ethics very clearly. Perhaps maybe that is that the whole system is one of trying these ideas on and letting them permeate one's vision and being in the world. It is ethical in its very nature, because it is embodying philosophy as a mode of transforming view and function. All right, Brian, shall we move on to the next question?
I think Lynn wanted to quickly comment,
Okay,
maybe
Lynn.
comment or respond.
I'm also in Claremont, Lynn.
Oh, great. We should get together.
Yes, so we're closer than we probably in space than we are now in the video.
So another thing, something else that I think is going on in this, in these
Well,
We've all been there, Lynn. We've all been there. Usually in the middle of class for me. So I think, Kevin, if it's okay, I think we're going to go on to the next question, if that's all right, Kevin and Lynn. Okay, feel free, Brianne.
Yeah, all right. So I'll just post it here in the chat for you all. 3 themes emerged in this article. Of course, more than that too, but I've picked out a few that are, I think, have resonance with later work. So 1 is the ingression of eternal objects. 2 is the adequate account of causation. And 3, the importance of ens or telos in metaphysics. And I was curious if any of these themes illuminated Whitehead's perspective on ethics for you, and how. So I would invite you here to just choose, if one of these you found really helpful, to sort of just put 1, 2, or 3, or use the phrase itself. And if there was something else, a kind of number 4 wild card that you felt was really helpful in helping you understand Whitehead's approach here, we could also use a kind of number 4 wild card. So why don't we take about 2.5 minutes on the clock, and you can just, again, in the chat, just hold it until I ask you to populate it, but identify 1, 2, or 3, or you can add in wild card. But did any of these descriptions of some common, some less common terms illuminate something afresh for you? Let's go 2.5 on the clock and we'll see you soon. Joe's given a post here and I'm just gonna stick the question on the other side of it and then we can read the middle of the cookie later. As you are ready, you're welcome to populate the chat and let's see what questions you all have taken up. All right, so our options here are number 1, eternal objects, number 2, causation, number 3, ends and telos. Let's just take a look at numbers here real quick.
Sorry, mine should say wild card. I didn't follow your rules. Sorry.
Oh, Brian, get it together. And let's see, Miriam, are you taking up a wild card or one of the numbers? Number 1? Miriam, give me some sound. Okay, number 3. Okay. All right, so I can see we've got some 2s, so why don't we start there and then we can clarify the other. So question number 2 was looking at the adequacy, an adequate account of causation. So let's take a couple of these 2s. Thomas says that this helped me somewhat with understanding what Whitehead meant by causal efficacy, which has always been a difficult concept for me. Thomas, are you there? Would you be able to elaborate at all on what the this is?
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, loud and clear, coming in.
Hi. Yeah, it's causal effect. I've always understood his term presentational immediacy, but I've never quite gotten a firm grasp of what he meant by causal efficacy. Now, when he talked about causation as memory, for some reason that helped clear up somewhat of my, I don't want to say misunderstanding, but lack of understanding. It's always been a difficult concept for me to understand what he meant by causal efficacy. And this helped somewhat.
Thanks. I'm glad to hear a little bit more about this. William, what question were you taking up?
It seems I'm speaking to purpose, telos, final
Telos,
causes.
okay. Great.
As
And-
I look at it, but in a social context and ethics. So that was, anyway, yes.
Yeah, well, I'll just read it out loud and maybe you can give a comment. William says, 406 paraphrase, that humankind is essentially social and must keep a harmoniously organized group, but an organization by virtue of larger bulk does not attain authority. The individual conscious retains final importance. Do you want to add anything there, William?
Well, only just, I wasn't sure what category to put it in.
It's all right.
I didn't, but then I looked, oh, final, that's it, purpose, that's, now we're back, that we are in your category of purposes, telos. The individual is very important, ultimately, finally important. So
Thank you.
can't go to sleep at the switch, folks.
And then it sounds like, Miriam, you're also taking up telos there. So maybe we'll start there. So Miriam says, and you can find that in the chat if you like, Miriam Bender, Whitehead has ethics as the conciliation of individual with community, including the ends toward which this conciliation effort organization is to be directed. Right, that telos there, which Whitehead places into metaphysical terrain. Quote, what is the world anyway? And Whitehead proposes a metaphysics of solidarity, not solipsism, that is against Cartesianism. Yet Whitehead equates the stable with the successful on page 405, and that for me is problematic. The idea that solidarity is stability. This feels like a pre-valuation rather than the effect of creativity. The idea that creativity is working well when it results in stability, and that creativity is evil when it results in destruction of order, when its results are destruction of order. Or maybe it's the words that provide me this notion rather than Whitehead per se, destruction, evil, solidarity, stability. Maybe we pause here. I think there's a lot in this question. Maybe we could just let some people weigh in for a moment. Just in reading it out loud right now, Miriam, I'm thinking about that essay we read a bit ago about humor versus wit. And didn't it seem like that, am I thinking that humor, one of the elements of humor was some kind of shared memory or some sort of sense of stability that for humor to function? That's just a thought here. Anyone want to weigh in on Miriam's observation here on telos and maybe some discomfort with the language?
I'll just say briefly, I was really excited to see his linking of teleology and ethics. As we know the story well, with the rise of modernity and the elimination of the forms and of the good and of the telos, value has no tether to the nature of reality, right? That there are no aims, there's just matter, it's just stuff. It has, it's meaningless, vacuous actuality. And so it's nice to see him pointing out that he's bringing back teleology and that has an ethical import, but it's not just sort of an Aristotelian one, right? Because now he's seeing it back in the structure of reality there, where everything has a teleological orientation. This is then hand in glove with his axiology, wherein everything has value for itself, for others, and the whole. And so it was just nice to see him making more explicit those connections that I was always sort of seeing, but feeling like it's always nice to see, but like, I'm not just making it up. Like he was seeing it a little bit too, even though he wasn't comfortable with fully running with it at any given time.
I see everyone, just to direct you to the bottom of the chat, Kevin has asked a question about looking for a particular article by John Cobb. So if anyone has any thoughts there, feel free to weigh in. And I'd love to hear the answer to that, Kevin. Let's go back up to the card. So Brian, I'll read it out loud. You've got a wild card, right?
Yeah, you want me to just kind of try to summarize it maybe real fast is, this might just be occurring to me, and I'd love feedback on whether or not I'm bringing this to the reading or whether it's there. I was just teaching in my environmental ethics class material about trying to help my students understand really the significance of adopting a holistic worldview, a conceptual framework which is not individualist, and that previously ethics was about trying to decide which individuals count, which one and which ones have intrinsic value, therefore requiring us to consider our direct duties to them. But it was always about the relationship of individuals, and ethics conceived as duties and obligations to and between individuals. And I was trying to help them understand that a holistic worldview is not just about sort of including ecosystems and species as other individuals, that it's rather completely changing, trying to get us to change our understanding of what an individual is. That we've been mistaken that there are no individuals in the sense described by Descartes or the moderns. That was always a fiction and a destructive fiction, and that it misled ethics fundamentally for the last 400 years. So that if we take to heart the full metaphysical significance or the full ethical significance of the metaphysics, then we have to reconceive of ethics. And so this essay started to show me that a little more, and maybe not even more in ways that he hadn't in modes of thought and adventures and elsewhere. So that was exciting for me, that he seems to see how fundamentally his ideas, his metaphysics should change how we conceive of ethics and solidarity and competition and robbery, that these things in an ecological worldview fundamentally changes. Holmes Ralston, one of my favorite philosophers who's not into metaphysics, but he has this great line where he says, our ethics needs to affirm ecology, not be in contradiction to it. And I see Whitehead as kind of giving our ethics needs to be to affirm an ecological metaphysics, not be in contrast to it. And so anyway, that was my thought, such as it is. Kevin.
I just wanted to sort of reiterate what you said. I started studying with John a long time ago. And as I read Whitehead and remember listening to John, it seems to me that ethics follow from your metaphysics, that you can't conjure them up separately and stick them together, that your ethical sensitivities, whatever they are, follow from your basic metaphysical vision. And I just want to agree with what you said.
Thanks, Kevin. Eric.
Eric, I was going to read your point, but I think since your hand's up, why don't you just take it from here? But I think it's on point too.
Yeah, so I always seem to be following Brian. I mean, I always seem to be addressing the same thing that he is, and so I'll go through my point and sort of relate it to what he said. I think that part of the thing here, and we've been knocking against this ethics question repeatedly through this conversation. I think that part of it is that Whitehead had not redefined ethics, and so his very idea of the philosophy of organism or process philosophy was at odds with the idea of ethics, in that it was not ethics was, as Brian said, such an individual thing, but the role of the individual was changing in Whitehead's view. And I do think an important point of this, though, is that this idea of value is reintroduced by as a virtue of the individual concrescence of actual entities. So there, and this value then gives rise to morality, which he says over pages, I noted it, but I think it's 397 to 398. And so I think that it's pretty obvious to me anyway that he's much more at home dealing with morality than he is with ethics. And so thereby I think that there might be this separation in Whitehead's thought between the idea of morals and a coded ethics, which seems to be at odds with his greater philosophical purpose. If that makes any sense.
I've got an essay from a few years ago on called Morality in the Making, where I try and collect together all these various comments and passages and references to ethics. And if I redid it, I would love to redo it and include these passages in this essay, which is new now. And just on Eric's point on ethics versus morals, there's some good evidence to support a version of that. He's against codification. He doesn't like. He thinks ethical principles are useful for the environment in which they were invented, and that they serve a purpose, but that we do harm when we codify them and make them permanent, right? And then they become an impediment, he says. But it's about for me. I would just conceive of a Whiteheadian ethic as one that would try to align the actions of moral agents with the aims of process itself, which is beauty and value, right? So that would, I mean, that's the direction that I think a Whiteheadian would need to head, and that we would need to do that by starting with the metaphysics and letting the ethics grow out of that metaphysics, rather than doing what too many people have done over the years, which is to say, is Whitehead more like a utilitarian, more like a Kantian, more like trying to make Whitehead fit into ethical boxes, which will not work because his metaphysics, like Kant's ethics, is an expression of his metaphysics. Mill's ethics, such as it is an expression of his psychology and his metaphysics. Aristotle's, so on, right? You get so. I'm deeply sympathetic with the idea that we need to start with his ethics or with his metaphysics, and then say, given that, what must appropriate moral behavior be like for moral agents given that metaphysics? Sorry, I'm going to stop talking, I promise. I get really excited about this. This is my favorite topic. So.
Right. Well, we don't have a lot of other things in the chat, but I didn't want to miss the middle of the cookie here. That Joe added something about. I'll read it, but Joe, you're going to have to read the last bit, right? So Joe says, unfortunately, there's no known audio recordings of Whitehead, and I wish there were. Here is a paragraph from an essay of mine, meaning Joe's, in an anthology of HL1. Will you read this, Joe, since you were the author? Just start there and give us this end part. I really want to hear you try to say it.
Now, let me just try and find it again in the chat. I'm having to. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, if you all scroll up, you'll find it just right in the middle of where I posted my question twice, and maybe you can follow along.
Then there was his voice. There are no known audio recordings of Whitehead, but many students wrote about how he sounded. In general, his speech was slow, gentle, and high-pitched. Richard Buke described it as dulcet and flute-like, and Louis Foyer said it contained a sing-song, soprano-like enthusiasm. We also know, as demonstrated by some amusing examples, that he had what might be considered a slight speech impediment, with his R's often sounding like W's. The most spectacular example of this appears in the notes of W.V.O. Quine, who at one point recorded Whitehead as saying of Plato that he definitely denies a frozen world of everlasting fixtures. I don't know. I mean, there's probably a right way of reading it. I think it almost sounds like a Brooklyn accent when you read it out loud.
It's supposed to be Elmer Fudd. That sounds like it's really not. it's not complimentary. And Weiss was a little bit of a jerk. So, Lynn.
Well, Quine, you mean? But
it reminds me of Baba Wawas.
Thank you, Quine too, actually. But they both made snotty comments in the margins of their
they
notes,
were.
which were regular and but quite, as Joe points out, and regularly that both Quine, I think it was both Quine and Weiss, am I right about that, where would correct Whitehead, or try to correct them, and sometimes incorrectly. I think you cataloged some of those, Joe.
Well, Weiss was the one who just couldn't understand Whitehead because, here was this kid from Brooklyn, and Whitehead had just come from across the pond. And so there's this passage, I think it shows up in a process studies article in the 80s, where someone was interviewing Weiss about his time with Whitehead. And he said, yeah, my first semester, I sat in front row of Whitehead's class, and I couldn't understand a word he was saying because our accents were so different. Yeah, funny stuff.
Peter, I noticed that you had a 3 written down. Did you want to give a response to point 3 or have some thoughts on that? Which would have been thinking about telos or the role of ends?
Is that me?
Yeah,
Yep.
I just saw that
Yep,
put
I
a 3
could-
there, but I didn't see any comments. I wanted to give you a chance.
And where are you coming from, Peter?
Sydney, Australia. Mainly, it was just much as Brian was saying, the formalization of his description of Descartes' formalization of the rejection of the Aristotelian position. I thought that was very clear.
Thanks, Peter. Joe, I asked earlier in a direct message if he could bring up the original documents that you read, just because it's interesting to see what we're working with and what, you see what we published, but Joe could share briefly, if you're able to, Joe, just what it is that we were working with. And in particular, we were talking about those blank spots. So in case you're curious what the originals look like, Joe's.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, here it is. Yeah, so, okay, this
Zoom in
is,
a tad more.
so to just look at some of the blanks, I mean, we can see we have some small ones here that are probably just 1 or 2 words, and that's often the case in this document. This one's perhaps a little longer. We have some.
Can you zoom in a tad more, Joe?
Yeah, let's see. Makes the scrolling less quick, but sometimes we get ends of lines where there's, who knows how much that is. There aren't often large gaps. And I think the one we were specifically looking at was here. This was the specialization one where the stenographer, I think, just got the word wrong. And considering that this was supposed to be Protestant here, I don't think there was anything else there, I suspect. But if we keep going
Because
down.
Joe, you do this a lot more. When we had the handwritten notes that are the vast majority of it, volume 1 and volume 2, students and colleagues in their handwritten script, you can kind of, it feels like you can get a better sense of how big of a gap there was, that they didn't catch something like this that's typed. It's just much harder to infer from my perspective. Would you agree?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, in a sense, if this person was trying to get every word, then you can, I think, perhaps take the gaps more literally, whereas in student notes, I mean, people are just taking them for themselves, and they might skip over, entire paragraphs worth of stuff, and you'd never know it unless you had other things to compare it with, which thankfully we had most of the time. So it's a different sort of thing to have to try and do. But yeah, I mean, this is the original, and you can see there are gaps in places. Usually they're fairly small, and they're probably only a couple of words. But I know that, for instance, like I had mentioned, just going through quickly here, there's that one that was even in the, yeah, we have here Dr. Hexter, and there's just nothing there. There's no question, which I think is reflected in the edited version we shared with you, where it's like, I guess the stenographer just completely missed getting that at all. So anyway, it's a brief look at that.
And I don't know, we're just about out of time, obviously, but if you had quickly at hand the Cabot handwritten stuff, if you don't have it, that's fine. It's kind of fun just to look at the original. What are our originals in this case, that were finally edited, and but we are just about. Oh, he's.
Yeah. So if we go, here's this obiter dicta. This is like Cabot working through basically Whitehead stuff, trying to integrate it into his own project of figuring out the fundamentals of the social sciences. He had 3 pages of that. And then there's his own notes. These are his own notes from the class. Not the best handwriting in the world, but he had about 6 pages and then stopped when he was having to start directing the discussion. So of course, there's nothing about notes from any of the responses in any of these 6 pages, but this is an instance where we saw some of those blanks or some of those words that we think maybe were misheard. We were able to take these notes and correct the other a little bit.
So it's kind of a fun example to give you all a window into sort of, we open a box and then we see these things. We see a few leaves of handwritten, and then we see a leaves of these typed, and then we're like, what is this? And it's kind of fun and interesting to sort of figure it out. Like because initially it seemed like maybe this was the original and then they typed it up, but no, that's not, but so it just sort of piecing together what can reasonably be inferred based upon the existing documentary evidence is the sort of stuff that we're doing.
It's kind of like archaeology.
Joe does a lot of that. We call it the Whitehead Mines. He's
Well, everyone, we are at time. Joe has given us another reading for next time, 3 weeks from today, the Al Smith toast and 80th birthday remarks. Joe, you have any short thoughts you want to share about this, or shall we just dive in?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a weird couple of small things. They don't necessarily, I think, go together super well in a sense, but they're both shorter pieces that we wanted to get to. And the Al Smith toast was in, that would have been 1929. Yeah, and then the 80th birthday remarks is 1941. So they're 12 years apart, but they're both interesting little things, and I'm looking forward to us looking at them. Al Smith, of course, was the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party in 1928, and he lost to Herbert Hoover. So here was Whitehead at a gathering of the Harvard faculty giving kind of a lengthy, like 5-page toast to him. So yeah, it's a weird, interesting thing that I don't think has been out there before.
Kevin, I see your hand up. Did you have something, or was that from previous comment? Oh, you're on mute.
No, I was trying to put my hand down. Sorry. It looks like it's up on the screen, but I can't tell. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. So just a reminder, everyone, we're going to have 2 more sessions, and then we're going to take